Mr. J is correct that that did not come up through testimony in this case, but it did come up either in the prior case or in discovery that I believe it was Mr. Scala who disassembled the gun. I would need to go back and find the site to the transcript.
He didn't testify to it in this trial.
Understood.
Okay. So the question the state is asking is, are your witnesses going to testify to these things? At the moment, I have no record evidence in this proceeding that the gun was disassembled or that the trigger pull has become heavier. As I recall, the trigger pull was 12 pounds in the last trial?
I think that's correct.
It was the same pull is what I remember.
That's correct.
So what Mr. J is asking is, because this is a Richardson issue, it's a discovery issue, are your experts now going to get on the stand and say that the gun was disassembled or that the trigger pull has become heavier on that gun since the first proceeding?
Understood. Could I have one moment, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Court permit us to consult with our expert, and could we readdress this at the lunch break?
Yes, but you need to let the state know if your expert's going to have any additional testimony by 1 o'clock today.
Understood. Thank you, Your
All
Honor.
right, no problem. Anything else, Mr. J?
Well, then, in passing that bridge, assuming that just goes to wait, if it goes into the analysis at all, it's the state's position that under the case law, Castillo, that it should be going back to the jury room. There has been testimony about trigger pull. There has thus far been testimony about an accidental discharge, according to Mr. Ward on the 911 call. And then, because he said, I just shot my wife 5 times, and then he said, when asked if he did it on purpose, he said it was accidental.
Well, he said it was an accident.
Right. So that's an accidental discharge. So there's that version. And then there's also a second version that she committed suicide with it. So fundamental to any analysis of this evidence is understanding what the trigger pull feels like. This isn't a matter of doing reenactments with actors and actresses in the back. I believe if they start asking for cases of wine and amplified, it's more about grip force. I believe it was on Cross where they went into that trigger pull doesn't really mean as much. You have to understand the grip force.
Right, but it's a combination of the grip force and the pull.
So it's the state's position that under the case law cited by both parties, it should go back. What they have, again, unearthed is the whether it's substantially similar or not for tests that are put on during evidence, which I'm not sure is applicable to the idea of the jurors examining the evidence. But again, without any evidence that this gun has somehow in old age become more difficult to fire, when upon visual examination, there's no oxidation going on in this firearm. It's the state's position it should be going back with the jury, unlocked.
I understand that, but until I find out whether they're experts, I don't have all the evidence is the problem. I'm being asked to rule. I mean, from what I read this morning, and again, I read it one time this morning. I got the gist of it. I did, for the record, make a note on it saying evidence, meaning there's no record evidence at this time. A lot of what's in that memorandum is, you know, it might have happened, this might have happened, but I don't have any evidence of that. So until I hear from the defense as to what their expert may or may not testify to, I can't rule. I don't know what their expert's going to say.
Well, the dilemma that the state of Florida is in is the state of Florida is resting its case this morning, and
right.
We would like to publish the firearm unlocked to the jury if it's not going to be going back with them to the jury room.
Well, where's your firearms expert? What state or city? I don't remember.
Maybe a second suggestion would be if we were to accomplish this, what we need to do between us by the break.
Yeah, I was about to tell you, if the state's resting this morning, I thought you were resting this afternoon. If the state's resting this morning, I need an answer this morning as to whether this is going to be something your expert's going to testify to, or that you want your expert to testify to, because at that point we're going to have a Richardson hearing on this. So instead of bringing the jury in here, how long is it going to take you to reach your expert?
I hope, well, it's Mr. Gillen's witness.
Your Honor, it's not necessarily witness. What we would be doing is checking the record from the prior proceeding in terms of deposition to try to locate the part of the transcript dealing with the disassembling of the gun. That, in our view, would be sufficient to...
Not unless it came out in this proceeding. This jury hasn't heard that. You can't just ask me to use as evidence in a new trial testimony that was given in an old trial or an old deposition that a witness was not questioned about in this trial. It is not part of this proceeding. This is where this all starts to get complicated. The gun expert was not questioned about disassembly because the disassembly caught my attention. And I went back through my notes on the gun expert, and the gun expert wasn't questioned about it. If you didn't bring it up in this trial, it doesn't exist for purposes of this trial.
Well, I think that if the court would indulge us by our giving us a period of time where we can make calls about the record, and if the record is what I believe it is, then we would then be, the person that we would want to be recalling would be the government's expert to confirm that he took it apart.
Mr. Scala?
Mr. Scala.
I have the transcript right here. You guys don't have the transcript from what? It's in the court file.
The transcript, my hard copy of Scala is back in my office because I thought we were through with him. But what I'm saying is that we could, over a break, we could get that done in terms of reviewing his deposition, his earlier deposition, and his prior testimony, and I think that would probably take care of it.
I need you guys to get started on it now. Is all three of you involved in cross-examining Dr. Stephany?
No, Your Honor, that Mr. Ellsworth is going to be doing that.
Okay. Like I said, the court transcript's in the court file. You can call it up, and I'll give you the page number that Scala starts on. The deposition, I don't know where you all have it.
Your Honor, we can get that, and we can have it taken care of shortly.
Mr. Scala's testimony begins at page 1547 of the trial transcript that's in the court file. All right. Anything else? Is the jury back up? We got them all? All right, let's bring the jury in. State recognized presence of the jury.
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense?
Your Honor.
Good morning, everyone. Have a seat, please. Welcome back. I hope you all had a good weekend. All right. Did anybody see anything, hear anything, read anything about this case over the weekend? Or up until the moment you've entered the courtroom? Anyone try to talk to you about the case? No? All right. Thank you very much. State, you may call your next witness.
Yesenia Leon Barron. Probably Leon.
You may inquire.
Thank you. Good morning, ma'am. Can you tell us your name and spell your first and last name?
Good morning. My name is Yesenia, Yesenia, Leon, Leon, Barron, B as in boy, Aron.
Where do you work?
I'm a retired special agent with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. I currently work for Fox Valley Technical College.
How long were you a special agent for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
A little over 12 years.
And what is a special agent for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
I was a sworn special agent where basically I had the same powers as any law enforcement. However, my jurisdiction was within the state of Florida.
So you were a sworn law enforcement officer?
Yes.
Does that require you to qualify with any firearms?
Yes.
And just briefly tell us about what firearms you had to qualify for and how frequently.
I had two weapons. One was an off-duty weapon. The other one was an on-duty weapon. My off-duty was a small, we call it baby Glock, which is a 27. And my on-duty was a 23, which is also a Glock.
And did there come a point in time, either 2010 or 2011, where you were asked to wash your hands at the FDLE lab, fire a .357 Magnum, and get GSR stamping done on your hands before and after?
Yes.
May I approach the witness with states 20?
You may.
Do you recognize the firearm that's contained within the box labeled states 20?
Yes, I do.
And what do you recognize it as?
A black on black revolver.
May the witness stand down?
She may.
And do you want gloves to handle this?
Yes, please.
There should be a box right there.
Those might be a little large. I think we have mediums somewhere. We did.
Okay.
All right.
I will make do.
Okay.
The medium's on the table.
Thanks, everybody. Stand down. Can you demonstrate for the jury how you held the firearm to test fire it?
Sure.
I know there's a red thing here.
Yeah, that's okay. That's first.
I'm sorry. 1 second. I gotta mic you.
If you all need to move around the courtroom, feel free to do that.
All right. Demonstrate how you held it to discharge it.
So I hold it the way I would normally. I don't like to bring it down where somebody's there, so that's okay. I'll bring it.
Point
I'll
that
bring
way.
point it down. So I brought it up to basically the target, and I pulled the trigger.
Did it go off?
It took some time. There was a pressure because this is a double action, so I had to apply some pressure to it.
And compared to other firearms that you've handled, how would you compare the pressure to pull this firearm's trigger?
It's not easy, but it can be done. But you have to apply pressure to it.
After you fire the firearm, does the firearm apply any force to you?
I have to hold it because it could kick back.
And when you discharged this firearm, did it apply any force back to you?
It did because although this hand, my left hand, maintains that support, I still had a little bit of a kickback.
Would you fire this firearm with one hand instead of just two, in your opinion?
Could it be possible for me to do that? Yes, but I will end up throwing the weapon, if you will, kind of flashback or kickback.
All right. You can replace it, and I don't have any more questions.
Cross.
Yes, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
My name is Craig Gillen. I just have a few questions.
Yes, sir.
You didn't really have anything to do with the investigation of this case, did you?
No, sir.
No GSR analysis that you did or DNA analysis or any of that, did you?
No, sir. I was just a duty agent.
Okay. And what you did is, right, it was kind of this, wasn't a real life situation because you washed your hands very thoroughly and kind of held them up like a doctor.
Correct.
And then as soon as you had washed them, then you fired the weapon as you indicated, correct?
Yes. Yes.
And then immediately thereafter, a GSR test was done on your hands?
It was done before and after.
Okay. You weren't asked to fire and then fall down, were you, on the ground to see?
No, sir.
You weren't asked to fire the weapon and have your hands bagged up to see whether or not or how much GSR would come off of your hands into the bags, were you?
As soon as I fired, they immediately took me and conducted that GSR right there.
And of course, we also assume that you weren't involved in any sort of struggle with another person over the weapon when you fired it. It was just you in there firing it, correct?
Correct.
Okay. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Redirect.
No, thank you.
May this witness be excused.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you, ma'am. You're free
Thank
to go.
you, Your Honor.
Call your next witness.
Jacqueline Fell.
You may inquire.
Good morning, ma'am. Can you tell us your name and spell your first and last name?
Jacqueline Fell, Jacquelinefell.
And where do you work now?
I work for Cox Media Group in Washington, D.C.
Back in the fall of 2011, where were you working?
News 13 here in Orlando.
Did you have an opportunity to do an interview with Mr. Ward?
Yes.
And do you see Mr. Ward in the courtroom today?
Yes.
May the record reflect she's identified the defendant? All right, and was that at his request?
No. We request that he accepted.
Okay. All right, and did you have an opportunity to review that interview this morning with me?
Yes.
And were those the answers to the questions that you asked him?
Yes.
At this time, the state would move AL for identification into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
I don't remember the number. 44. This will be received without objection as states number 44.
No other questions?
Cross.
No questions, Your Honor.
May this witness be excused.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. You're free to go.
I actually figured out.
Call your next witness.
Joshua Stephany.
You may inquire.
Good morning, sir. Can you tell us your name and spell your first and last name?
Joshua Stephany, Joshua
Where do you work?
the District 9 Medical Examiner's Office.
What do you do there?
I'm the Chief Medical Examiner.
And what's your educational background to be the chief medical examiner?
4 years of undergraduate school, 4 years of medical school, 5 years of pathology residency, 1 year of forensic pathology fellowship.
And what's your professional experience as far as the field of forensic pathology?
I've been employed since July 2007.
Was that your first job in this field?
Yes,
Approximately how many autopsies have you performed over the years?
over 2,500.
Approximately how times have you been called either in deposition or in trial to give opinion testimony about cause or manner of death?
Over 200.
Have you ever not been allowed by a court of law to offer an opinion on cause or manner of death?
No.
And tell the jury what forensic pathology is, Dr. Stephany.
Forensic pathology is a subspecialty of pathology. Pathology is a study of disease. Forensic pathology is a subspecialty, meaning we know everything in pathology, the study of disease, but we do it more on a medical legal basis when we're looking for cause and manner of death.
All right, and tell us about the process of how you get notified about a death that might incur the jurisdiction of the medical examiner's office.
Well, we're contacted first by either law enforcement, a hospital, or family that death had occurred, and then it's up to us to determine whether or not it's in our jurisdiction. By jurisdiction, I don't mean location jurisdiction, I mean by state statute, whether or not we can take the case.
And were you contacted in the middle of the night or early morning hours about the death of Diane Ward?
No.
All right.
Me personally, no.
All right. And when would you have been notified about Mrs. Ward's passing?
Probably the next day.
So you didn't have anything to do with the decision whether or not you would go out to the scene of where Mrs. Ward was found?
No.
Is that something that you usually do or not usually do here at the 9th District Medical Examiner's Office?
The doctors typically do not. We have forensic investigators who are on 24/7. They act as our eyes and ears, and they go to the scenes.
All right, and so my next question is, obviously you already answered the doctors don't usually go out there. Is it the normal practice for your investigators to go out and start collecting evidence off of the body, such as gunshot residue kits?
No, they will not do that on the scene.
Why not?
First of all, it's not their job. Second of all, we'd like to do it in a controlled environment. They will place brown paper bags over hands or feet, depending on what evidence they're trying to maintain. The body will then be sealed and brought to our office in under a sterile or a more serene or private location. We will take gunshot residue at our office.
All right. And do you also look at what is on a deceased person's hands?
Yes.
And is there a two-step process to that? Do you do that before cleaning the body as well as after cleaning the body?
Yes.
Does that help assist you in understanding what is a injury on the actual person versus blood or other materials that might have just been on the person's skin.
Yes.
All right. And would you be able to do that had you even gone out to the scene yourself?
I could look at the hands, what we call dirty, meaning as they are at the scene, but we do not clean them at the scene.
All right. So would it have been practical for you to gone out there and done GSR testing and examining her hands for any suspected blood patterns and then cleaning them up to see if there were injuries on her?
Not really.
Okay. So tell us about how you do come into contact with Mrs. Ward's body. What's the process of, once that body arrives at the medical examiner's office, how does it come to your attention as the person who's going to do the autopsy?
Well, there are multiple doctors in our office at that time. I believe there were 5. Typically, there's 2 scheduled for the morgue that day. Those 2 doctors scheduled for the morgue will just divide up the cases. We don't really have a way to do it other than just we pick which ones we're doing that day. On that specific day, I did the autopsy on Mrs. Ward.
All right, and so what is the first step in the autopsy process? What do you do first as the medical examiner?
An autopsy is not just what people think it is, dissecting an individual. First, we have to get our investigative information. Second, we examine the individual externally, then internally. All this time, we'll document any injuries, natural disease processes, clothing, identifying features. A lot of that's externally. Once that's complete, we will then proceed internally. Again, looking at the organs, what we call in situ, meaning in the body. We will document any injuries, any natural disease processes. At this time, we will also take specimens for toxicology testing. Once that's complete, we will continue and take the organs out of the individual. Again, looking for any injuries or natural disease processes, also documenting photographically or with our written notes.
Does the medical examiner's investigator, excuse me, document the scene and the body as they find it as well?
Yes.
Do you rely upon those photographs that they take to help your understanding of what the cause and manner of death is?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, can we read the stipulation?
The Assistant State Attorney William Robert J. and Defendant James Robert Ward, as well as his lawyer Sean Ellsworth, stipulate that the identity of the deceased in this case is Diane Elizabeth Ward.
Permission to work with AU for identification with the witness?
Granted.
Can you see that image, Doctor?
Are the jurors able to see this image?
It's not in evidence yet?
Nope. And I've got it as unpublished. All right, there we go.
Can you see it, Dr. Stephany?
Yes.
Okay. Showing you image 1 on that folder, image 8, image 38, image 51, image 53, image 62, 67. Those images that we just discussed, were those not taken by you?
That's correct. I did not take those.
Now, beginning with 73, I'm going to ask you if you recognize these images. 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 129, 130, 134, 135, 149, 154, 155, 156, 157, 158, 159, 160, 161, 162, 163, 164, 165, 166, 167, 174, 175, 176, 177, 178, 179. Those latter images, do you recognize those images?
Yes, I do.
And where do you recognize them from?
They were taken during the course of the autopsy.
State would move AU for identification purposes into evidence.
Any objections? Yes. Any other objections? All right, this will be admitted as State's Exhibit Number 45 over objection.
Okay. As you did the external examination of Mrs. Ward's body in the clothes as she was presented to you, could you see any external injuries?
Yes.
And where could you see an external injury?
There was
Or
an injury
injuries?
to the face.
I'm sorry?
An injury to the face.
All right. And based on your examination of that evidence at that point in time, did you have any opinions as to what may have caused that injury at that point?
It would be consistent with a gunshot wound.
And what is your opinion based upon?
Well, as I said earlier, we don't work in a vacuum. We do have investigational history when we start the autopsy. And then our investigators reported that there was a gunshot wound. The injury itself was on the left side of the nose. It was circular. And around the area is what we call stippling, which are small little punctate lacerations and abrasions on the skin.
All right. And had you ever seen a gunshot wound on a body before?
Yes,
How many times?
over 200.
All right. Any other injuries that you saw during the external examination of Mrs. Ward before cleaning her up?
No.
All right. And that injury that you saw to her face, would that be consistent with producing the blood pattern that you saw on Mrs. Ward and her clothing?
Yes.
Would it be consistent with the blood pattern you saw at the scene?
Yes.
And can you just bring us through the mechanism of how a blood pattern gets produced after a gunshot wound to the head?
Well, when a gun is fired, a projectile will come out at a very high speed. The projectile will strike the decedent. When it strikes specifically the head, not only is a projectile that goes in, but the energy it causes may cause what we call a temporary cavity. So the energy goes in, tissue may expand and then contract again. So when you get blood spatter, it could be directly, meaning directly from the injury itself. If a artery or a vein or another vessel is injured, blood may spurt out or leak out, or that contraction of the tissues going back on that temporary cavity may push some of the blood out.
Can blood both spurt out as like in a projection event as well as drip out from a wound like that?
Yes.
Okay. And is there some sort of difference in the vessel or vessels that the blood is coming from to cause those two different events?
Well, if an artery is struck, the arteries are the vessels that carry blood away from your heart, and they're under higher pressure. Veins carry the blood back to the heart, which are under lower pressure. So if an artery is struck and the heart is still pumping, that pressure may push blood out of the artery and cause it to spurt.
So anything else of note occurred during the external autopsy of Mrs. Ward?
No.
All right. After doing the external autopsy, well, let's talk about her hands. Did you see anything on her hands before you cleaned her up?
Other than the blood, no.
Okay. And then when you cleaned up her hands, did you see any injuries where you had seen blood pattern previous?
I did not.
After you cleaned her up, did you see any other injuries on her body?
There was some faint contusions on the abdomen and one on one of the upper extremities.
Would those injuries be consistent with a struggle over a gun, in your opinion?
It's possible. I believe the ones on the abdomen were a little fainter and maybe had a yellowish color to them, so they appear to be older.
And what about on, where did you say, the arm?
One of the upper arms, it was a little more pinker, so that would be consistent with possible the timing of the injury to the head.
And is there really any way to date a bruise?
Not really. We don't specifically say exactly. We can't say within an hour or days. Bruises have kind of a continuation where they change in color. If anyone's been bruised, you know that normally starts out with that dark purple color, and then it kind of transitions to a yellow or green. That's because of the break in the blood. So we kind of go by color, and normally when you see that yellowish color, it's about a week old. But as far as narrowing it down any more than a couple days to a week, we can't do that.
Permission to begin publishing States 45.
Granted. It's not coming up yet. Now it's coming up.
All right, and image 1, is that like a case card with the medical examiner case number on it?
Yes.
And the investigator may have heard her name as being Diane Wood at the time?
That's correct.
Was that cleared up later?
Yes, it was.
All right, looking at image 8, based on your previous testimony about the blood patterns that can result from a gunshot wound to the head, do you see anything there that can help explain this to the jury?
In this photo, you see a picture of blood on the wall right below that window.
And based on this pattern's shape and size, can you say anything about what may have caused it?
All I can say is that it's not inconsistent with a gunshot wound.
Okay. Image 38. Are you familiar with a prescription drug called Cymbalta?
Yes.
And what is that?
I forget the generic name, but basically it's a sleep aid. It also helps relieve anxiety.
And how about alprazolam?
Alprazolam is a benzodiazepine. The common or the proper name is Xanax.
And what does that do?
It's a benzodiazepine. It helps relieve depression or anxiety.
Okay. All right, and in image 51, what are we looking at here?
We're looking at the decedent as we found her, or my investigator found her on the scene.
And is that consistent, the bagging of her hands and feet, with how you saw her when you did her autopsy?
Yes, it is.
And image 53, is that consistent with the blood pattern you observed on her shirt when you did the autopsy?
Yes.
And image 62, based on that wound to her face, do you believe there's any relationship between that and the blood pattern that we see here?
It's consistent to where the injury was and the position she was found in.
Image 67, what are we looking at?
We're looking at the decedent's pants, and we're seeing blood smeared on both lower extremities, more predominantly on the right leg.
Now, those previous images, is that consistent with her perhaps have been standing at one point after the gunshot?
I believe so, yes.
Now, in looking at image 73, was there any blood on this image? And what is this image of?
This is the decedent's right hand. There is some blood. If you maybe zoom out a little bit more, you can see blood kind of on beneath the hand on the 5th digit. And
You have the ability to go up there and hit the top right arrow. There's a green arrow, and then you can pull up some drawing tools.
See the little pen?
Yeah.
You can clear what is there first. There. All right, right where my arrow pointer is that anything?
Yeah, the little.
Just drag it with your finger.
There's a little blood right here.
Anywhere else?
Some blood here. And can you zoom out a little bit? Or can I zoom out?
I can do that.
Yes. Right here on the top of the hand and some on the wrist.
All right, can you clear that? And that was image 73 for the record. What are we looking at in 74?
Again, still the same right hand, and you see a little more diffuse blood on the right hand, over the thumb, and over the lateral part of the hand.
And is that pinkish discoloration on the bottom of her forefinger, is that related to injury, or is that another process that occurs after someone passes?
That's not related to injury. There may be some lividity.
And what is lividity?
Lividity means blood kind of flows either dependent or with gravity. When a body is at rest or is deceased, blood will just flow downwards with gravity.
What are we looking at in 75?
Again, more blood on the right hand, right here.
76?
Still more blood. You see it on all 5 digits and on the base of the thumb.
77, is this her left hand?
Yes.
And do we see any blood pattern here?
There's a little blood here at the top of the hand.
Now, as a medical examiner, does the diameter of a blood pattern have any relevance to you?
To me, no.
What are we looking at in 78?
Still the left hand. You see some blood on the left side of the wrist. On the side of the wrist.
How about on the fingers or the thumb?
You see some on the top of the hand, maybe some speckles on the thumb and on that second digit.
What are we looking at in 79?
Still the left hand. You see some blood right on the inside of the pinky.
80?
Still the left hand. You see some blood around the wrist, on the bottom of the picture near the watch.
Now in 100, is this her right hand after the cleaning?
Yes.
And do you see any sign of injury or other natural discolorations where we were just talking about blood pattern?
I do not.
Same for 101?
That's correct.
102?
I don't see any injury.
103?
I don't see any injuries.
104?
Again, no injuries.
105?
There's no injuries.
106?
Again, no injuries.
107?
No injuries.
And at some point between this photograph and the quote-unquote dirty photographs, were something done to her nails? They seemed longer before.
Yeah, as part of our evidence collection process, we take fingernails for evidence.
All right, now in 129, what are we looking at here?
This is the decedent's face. To the left side of her nose, you see the round entrance wound. There's a small abrasion on the left side of the nose. And all that red dot around the wound is what I called previously stippling. It's that small little lacerations and abrasions. And what that is caused by is burnt and unburnt gunpowder as a projectile exits the barrel of a gun. When a gun is fired, it's not just the projectile that comes out. You get smoke or soot comes out, as well as these burnt and unburnt projectiles, which is gunpowder, which comes out and also struck to the scene in this case.
Did you make any attempt with that ruler in that photograph to measure the height of that stippling pattern?
Yes.
And then in a subsequent image, did you measure the diameter?
Yes.
Did you also examine her neck and other parts of her body for stippling?
Yes.
Did you see any stippling on her neck or other parts of her body?
I did not. The only other parts of the body I saw was actually in the eyes themselves.
And does that have any relevance, stippling in one's eyes, as to whether or not what the manner of death was versus homicide, suicide, or an accidental struggle?
In this case, what that tells me only is that the decedent's eyes were open at the time the gun was fired.
And just to be certain with my question, does that have any relationship to your determination of manner of death?
It can at times.
Did it this time?
Not really.
Okay. Did you also examine her clothing for signs of that stippling?
Yes.
Did you see any?
No.
And now you described it as abrasions or lacerations to the skin.
Yes.
Obviously, clothing can't be abrased or lacerated, so what would you be looking for on skin as far as stippling?
Skin or clothing?
I mean, but what happens when clothing catches some stippling?
On clothing, you may actually see the small little gunpowder granules, but for the unburnt ones, if they are burning at the time it's fired, you may see little burns.
All right, now, after you had taken those measurements of diameter and height of the stippling pattern of her face, could you get the full diameter of the pattern on her face, or was it wider than her face?
I measured the best I could because some of the small granules have gone farther than the face itself as possible. If you picture if anyone played billiards or pool, it's much like that. When you initially break and the balls go scatter, that's pretty much how a gun shot stippling spreads out once it's fired. The closer you are, the very narrow and dense it is, the farther you away from the barrel of that gun, it spreads out. So the gunpowder, that burnt and unburnt gunpowder granules, become less dense and they become spread out. So could a few of the granules have gone past their head? It's possible.
Did you ultimately do any comparisons between some patterns of gunshot powder versus her face?
Yes.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
What I'm showing you is what has been marked for identification purposes as AS. Can you examine the contents of AS to yourself without showing the jury? Do you recognize AS?
Yes, I do.
What do you recognize AS as?
Those are transparencies I made test firing the weapon at different ranges.
Did you actually test fire the weapon, or were you present for it?
I was present. I did not actually test fire the weapon.
All right, and in making them, did you have anything to do with AR for identification?
Repeat your question, please.
Did AR have anything to do with you making the transparencies that we talked about in AS?
Yes.
And what's the relationship between the two items?
What you just showed me as evidence were photocopies of the actual cotton fabric that we used for test firing the weapon.
And the last page, is that also a photograph of the stippling on Mrs. Ward?
Yes.
And is that what you used to compare?
Yes. When you saw previously in the picture, there was a ruler in the scene when we took the injury. We use that to size the picture for an exact 1-to-1 ratio, so we can know the exact scale.
And so this last page, the image of Mrs. Ward, has that been resized to actually reflect 1 centimeter being 1 centimeter?
Yes.
Showing you states 42 in evidence. Do you recognize 42?
Yes, I do.
And what do you recognize it as?
Those are the actual 9-inch by 9-inch pieces of cotton fabric that were used as a target to test the range of fire from the gun.
And so if you wanted to, or if anybody wanted to, they could take your transparencies and see if they match up with the actual cloth twills?
That's correct.
Would you just mind doing that with one of them? Now, before you do that, let me back that up. Are these labeled in any way so that you know what distance they were fired from?
Yes, they are.
And if it was fired more than one time, which one of that one time at that distance?
Yes.
Okay.
You want me to just choose any transparency?
Sure. What one are you going to use?
This one says 18 inches.
Okay. And does it identify which number of shot at 18 inches if there was more than one?
I believe it says 1.
Okay. Can you find that in the actual cloth twills and look at it? The actual cloth twills. Does it match?
Yes, it does.
So the photocopying, at least at that one particular image, didn't appear to change or alter anything.
No.
Okay. All right, if you can replace all the transparencies back. Your Honor, at this time the state would move AR and AS for identification and evidence.
Any objections? Right. AR will be received as State's Exhibit Number 46. AS will be received as State's Exhibit Number 47, both without objection.
And how many were at 6 inches? Do you remember?
I believe we did 3 at 6 inches, 3 at 12 inches, 3 at 18 inches, 3 at 24 inches, and 1 at 30 inches.
All right. And do you recall if any of the rounds that were used in the cloth twill testing involved ammunition that was taken from the gun as it was found?
I believe we test fired 1 at 18 inches with the actual gun and ammunition taken from the scene.
Any other distances?
They may have fired 1 at 12 inches previous to my involvement, just to see if they got we didn't test fire everyone with the same ammunition because we only had so much ammunition from the scene to test fire. So law enforcement had to get ammunition that most closely approximated the ammunition found at the scene. So I believe they test fired 1 at 12 inches with the ammunition, and then test fired 1 at 12 inches with the ammunition they bought with a lot similar to the one found at the scene, so they could compare those two.
And were you able to form any opinions as to what pattern or patterns most closely resembled the pattern on Mrs. Ward?
From the test findings we did, the gun that was fired at 18 inches away from the target was most closely approximated the stippling pattern on the decedent.
And what would you say, in your opinion, was the next best or best?
There really wasn't a next best. I mean, again, the next closest were 6 inches away, either one direction or the other. So it's my opinion that 18 inches most closely approximated. Now, we could have gone out in 1 inch increments and maybe gotten a better window, but we did not.
I think AE is a gap. May I approach the witness with AE?
You may.
Dr. Stephany, would a yardstick help you demonstrate to the jury what 18 inches looks like?
Yes.
All right. If you would, could you demonstrate with AE?
Well, a yard is 36 inches, so 18 is obviously a half.
Is that marked AE as in A echo?
Alpha elephant.
So 18 inches would be right here. Either way, because again, I said it's in the middle, so.
As part of the autopsy, did you take any samples from Mrs. Ward?
Yes.
And from where?
We take blood samples from the heart and from the veins.
And did you send blood samples off to a laboratory to have toxicological testing done?
Yes.
And what results, if any, were of note?
Really, I mean, in the overall process of determining the cause and manner of death, none, but as far as the findings were concerned, she had alcohol.
Let's stop there. Alcohol, is that ethanol?
Yes.
Drinking alcohol?
Yes.
What was her level in her blood, and did you also do eye fluid?
The level in the blood was 0.113. The level in the eyes, let's see. Oh, I don't seem to have an eye. Oh, an eye level here.
I'm sorry?
I don't seem to have an eye level here. It seems I also have as a level on the blood.
All right, and what, if anything, what is ethanol? What class of drug or substance is that?
Alcohol is a sedative.
And what sorts of behaviors or what can one observe in one who's consuming alcohol at that level?
Generally speaking, alcohol, as I said, is a sedative. By sedative, I mean it calms you, it dulls your senses.
And is there any way to say what specific behaviors or effects this alcohol was having on Mrs. Ward at the time of her death?
Not really, no.
And why not?
I can't tell how a specific individual reacts to a certain drug or alcohol based on, as a class of drug, what they overall do. Different people react differently to different drugs. I'm sure many of you are aware of your own experiences or witnessing. People who take alcohol may not be calm at first. It affects them differently. Some may actually get excited at first and then become calm. It affects different people different ways.
Was it in any ways like a toxic level of ethanol? Did this have any relationship to her death?
No.
And can one build to tolerance to ethanol if they consume it regularly over
Yes.
time?
Yes, they can.
All right, was there any other substances of note in her toxicology report?
Citalopram.
All right, and can you tell us what citalopram is?
Citalopram, not to be confused, I believe another drug was mentioned earlier, Cymbalta. This is citalopram. Citalopram is what we call a SSRI. So it's a mood stabilizer, is used to treat depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disease. It acts by increasing the serotonin in your central nervous system to help. Again, it's got a calming effect, anti-anxiety, antidepressive.
And what were her levels at the time of her death?
840 nanograms per milliliter.
Well, let me back that up. At the time of the blood sample being drawn, what was it?
840 nanograms per milliliter.
All right, and can you say as a medical pathologist whether that has any relationship to her levels at the time of her death, before she died?
We use the levels post-mortem to approximate what the levels were at the time of death. There are so many variables that at the time of death, it may be higher, it may be a little lower, but it's the best we can do is to approximate the levels at the time of death.
Are you familiar with a process called post-mortem redistribution?
Yes.
And can you describe that to the jury?
Yes. When you take alcohol or drugs or anything, it's not a linear relationship. It doesn't mean if you take twice the amount, you're going to have twice the level. That's not how it works. What happens is when you take any substance, drug, or alcohol, you ingest it, it gets absorbed in your bloodstream, and then it goes into your organs, your liver, your kidneys, spleen, and it's there. Those are solid organs. That's what is distribution. And then what happens is when someone passes away, it was called postmortem redistribution. That blood, that drug or alcohol may seep back into the blood prior to us taking an autopsy. So depending on what phase the drug is being absorbed, is it still being absorbed? Is it being metabolized? How long the person's been dead? How much postmortem redistribution, meaning how much of that drug diffused back into the blood? Again, everyone's different, so we can just approximate the best we can at the time when we take the blood that it is approximated at the time of death.
And can, again, like ethanol, can the length of time that somebody is on a drug like citalopram affect how much they have absorbed into their tissues over that course of time?
Repeat the question, please.
Like alcohol, can you build up a tolerance, or can there be a certain amount of buildup of this drug, citalopram, into the tissues the longer you've been on it?
You can build up a tolerance, yes.
And so if somebody's been on it for, say, 50 months, a little over 4 years, what would that, if anything, help you say about the citalopram levels in Mrs. Ward?
It really has nothing to do with the levels. I mean, it just tells me that if someone's been on it for that long, they can build up a tolerance to the drug. Much like alcohol, they will react differently to it. They may need more of the drug, much like alcohol, in the long run to achieve the same results.
This postmortem redistribution, is it still a possible factor in drawing blood from a peripheral area, such as the artery or vein from the leg, as opposed to somewhere in the chest?
Yes.
Right. Is it fair to say that it's a less likely effect, more peripheral you are to the chest?
Yeah, the heart obviously is central, and blood is already concentrated there, plus it's closer to those solid organs, so it's more prone to redistribution. When we talk about a peripheral site, we're normally talking about an iliac vein, which is farther down to the top of the leg. So that's a little more protected from postmortem redistribution, but it's not 100% protected.
And can you say at 840 nanograms per milliliter, is that a toxic level of citalopram? Did this have any effect on her death?
Well, the ultimate cause of death, no. When we look at levels of drugs, we have to look at evidence-based previous cases of people overdosing where no other possible cause of death could have been a factor. These levels are in nanograms per milliliter. When they talk about overdoses of a drug such as citalopram, they're talking about milligrams per milliliter, which is 10 to the 6, if you times more than what the levels we're reporting. So to put that in perspective, 840 nanograms would be like 0.00084 milligrams per milliliter. So when we're talking toxic ranges, did citalopram or benzodiazepines cause someone's death? We need to see a lot higher than that.
Can you say what, if any, effect the citalopram had on her behavior at that point when her life ended?
On Mrs. Ward specifically, no. In general, again, alcohol is a sedative, citalopram is a sedative. When you combine them, they will have typically synergistic effects, causing someone to be, lose their senses a little bit, that dull their senses.
And are you familiar with all the different side effects of citalopram at normal levels, more than normal levels, and then at toxic levels?
I believe so, yes.
And can you just give the jury an understanding of what the side effects are expected with this drug from normal levels, normal usage?
Repeat the question again, please.
What are the side effects? What is citalopram supposed to do? And then what have any studies shown that it also does when taken at normal levels as prescribed?
Citalopram is, again, supposed to help treat people with OCD, with social anxiety, with depression, with regular anxiety. So it sort of stabilizes you, calms you. If you look at complications or adverse reactions, it could be a whole laundry list of things. You could have anywhere from hypersensitivity or allergic reactions to maybe possibly have the opposite effect, to maybe making someone nauseous. So when people do drug studies and they're studying new drugs, anytime someone reports an adverse reaction, that's what has to be reported as a complication of that drug. So anytime, whether it's proven to be related or not, it has to be listed.
And how about if one takes more than the prescribed level or has a sudden change in the level that they're taking in citalopram? Are you aware of any side effects that might come from that happening?
To my knowledge, it would be basically increasing the sedative effect.
And have you ever been made aware of, in the research, of people being reported to be aggressive, hallucinate, anything like that from this drug?
I wouldn't be surprised if that was a possibility. Like I said, there may be actually adverse reactions that are opposite to what you would expect. So if someone reported that, I wouldn't be surprised.
But again, do you have any idea what, if any, side effects Mrs. Ward was experiencing at the time of her death?
I do not.
And do you feel like the level of citalopram in her blood at the time of the blood draw at the autopsy is a reliable indicator of her blood level when she was alive?
It's as reliable as we can get, yes.
Okay. But it has limitations?
Yes,
All right. Did you examine the contents of her stomach?
I did.
And what were the contents of her stomach?
She had 10 milliliters of pink fluid.
Did you see any evidence of pill residue, the cap, the thing that surrounds the pill sometimes so it doesn't taste terrible? Do you see anything like that in her stomach?
I did not.
All right. And is the fluid that you saw in her stomach, is that consistent with red wine, perhaps?
It could be, yes.
Among other things?
Yes.
All right. Did you collect those contents and send them off to the lab to be tested?
I did not.
And why not?
I didn't feel it was necessary to help determine the cause and manner of death in this case.
And why not?
When you run a test or you ask a question, you have to know what you're going to do with that answer. If I took toxicology on the gastric contents and got a result back, it really wouldn't answer any questions to help determine the cause and manner of death for me.
And did you examine her bladder contents?
I did.
Did you send them off to the lab to be tested?
They were sent off, but they were not tested.
All right. And why not?
Again, testing it would not help any way, one way or the other, to help determine my cause and manner of death.
Were you able to determine a cause of Mrs. Ward's death after doing both the external and internal autopsy?
Yes, I was.
What was the cause of her death?
The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head.
And what's the mechanics, the mechanism? What actually caused the process for her cells to die?
Well, it's multifactorial. The projectile itself going through an individual's head causes injury. Then there's, the mechanisms of blood leaking out. You become hypovolemic, you're losing blood. There's a direct injury to the respiratory center of someone's brain, which causes them to stop breathing. It's the injury itself, and then there may be things right after the injury, such as blood leaking out of the head.
And did her skull have any injuries in addition to obviously the entry wound?
Yes.
And can you describe that for the jury?
There were fractures of the nasal bones, which are bones of the nose, facial bones, and fractures of the skull itself.
And how does that relate to the projectile?
There were fractures in the back of the skull where part of the projectile exited. So we know when the projectile entered and exited, we can sort of put a probe in there and know the direction. The other fractures may be caused by what's called sort of a concussive effect, as I said earlier. When a projectile enters the head, you have not just projectile, all the energy. So tissues expand. They can kind of concuss and cause almost like a small blast injuries. So you may get fractures farther away from the actual projectile path itself.
Were you able to determine the trajectory of the projectile?
Yes, I was.
And what was the trajectory as far as the three planes of front, back, left, right, up, down?
The direction of the path of the wound through the decedent's head was front to back, right to left, and upward.
And is there any way, any adjective, any qualification would you say to any of those directions as far as front to back, up to down, left and right?
Yeah, slightly. I mean, the front to back is clear. It's a front to back trajectory. The up or down trajectory is definitely upward, but it's a slight upward, and the same with the right to left.
Now, you said that it exited the skull. Did the projectile actually exit Mrs. Ward's entire head?
No, it did not.
And where was it found?
The projectile itself was found inside the head, on the inner table or the inside of the skull of the occipital bone, which is the back of the head. The casing, or the jacket of the projectile was found on the outer table of the skull. So the jacket and the actual core had separated in the head, and the jacket came outside the skull, but not outside the head.
And did you form an opinion as to manner of death?
Yes, I did.
And what was your opinion?
The manner of death was homicide.
And what was your opinion based upon?
My opinion is based upon the trajectory, which is pretty much a straight head-on shot wound to the head. Like I
Well,
said,
let me stop you there. What is the basis that forms your opinion that the trajectory has a relationship to manner of death?
Well, if you're looking at other manners of death, being accident, suicide, undetermined, or natural, the most one that you may think other than homicide would be suicide. And so, typically in suicides, trajectories are not front to back. They're typically, I say 90 to 95%, to one side of the head or the other. I mean, there are some from the back of the head, some from the front of the head. But typically they're from the side of the head. So trajectory in that respect plays an important part to me, meaning, and the ones on the front of the head that we see in suicides are typically under the chin, in the mouth, forehead. So the fact that this was almost straight on into an individual's head played a role. And the other thing that played a role for me in determining homicide was the range or the distance of most approximately 18 inches from the decedent's head, judging by that stippling pattern. Again, in my experience training in studies I reviewed, 95% of those suicides are close. Either they're contact or within a couple inches. People don't typically, if they're doing a suicide, shoot themselves straight on from 18 inches away from the head with their eyes open. So those main factors of trajectory and range led me to determine a homicide for the manner.
And you explained to the jury how that ruled out self-inflicted or a suicidal wound. How about in comparison to a struggle, or I guess as you would say, an accidental manner of death?
If there was a struggle over a weapon and it was truly accidental, you would think an individual struggling with a weapon would know that they're struggling with a weapon, and number one, not have their eyes open, for one. Number two, I would think an angle would be a little more acute or different. I mean, if you're struggling with a weapon, you don't typically look at it as you're struggling for it, knowing it may go off. You would think you would turn your head one way or the other. So for me, that played a factor. Again, the trajectory and the distance.
Back to permission to publishing, I believe it was 45.
Great. It's up.
All right, and states 130 real quickly, that was you measuring the diameter of the stippling pattern on Mrs. Ward?
Yes.
And 134, what are we looking at here?
It's an abrasion or contusion, I believe that's on the right upper extremity.
Right where?
Right upper extremity.
And is there any way to date or age that?
No, it looks, somewhat fresh. It's still got that red color, so, I would say maybe hours to up to a day.
Another image of that at 135?
Yes.
And what is being squared in by the scale there? Is that something that you're looking at?
Yeah, it's hard to see in the picture, but I describe it as a faint contusion or a faint bruise.
Any way to date or age that?
No.
And real quickly in 149, is that reflective of the trajectory of the projectile?
Yes, it is.
Did you recover the projectile?
Yes, I did.
What are we looking at in 154?
That's a projectile of the, that's a photograph of the actual projectile core.
Closer up in 155?
Yes.
156?
Yes.
What are we looking at in 157?
That's a jacket. And let me clarify, I don't know if I misspoke earlier. It was actually the core that went through the skull and into the scalp, but the jacket stayed inside the head.
158?
Still the jacket.
159?
Yes, a closer view.
160?
Those are socks.
161?
The other side of the socks.
162?
Sneakers.
163?
The back of the sneakers.
164?
The front and top of the sneakers.
165?
The sole of the sneakers.
166?
The sides of the sneakers.
167?
The other sides of the sneakers.
174?
The shirt the decedent was wearing.
175?
The back of the shirt.
176?
The pants the decedent was wearing.
177?
The other side of the pants.
178?
That's a picture of the evidence we collected during the time of the autopsy.
And looking at the photograph, pulled hair, fingernails, projectile, jacket. Anything else collected in this image?
DNA card would be in that smaller manila envelope.
Is that just a few drops of blood on a card?
Correct.
What are we looking at in 179?
Those are the bags that you saw in the previous photographs, or the brown paper bags that we use to seal the scene's hands and feet at the scene.
Did you have, you yourself or your technician open up, slice the bags that were around her hands and do GSR testing on the inside of the bags?
We don't do the bags, no.
Why not?
That's we pretty much stick to the body. We'll look for evidence on the body, the clothing on the body if we have to, but actual physical evidence such as those bags or clothing, they'll be looked at more closely by law enforcement. They may do things such as beat the clothing or beat the bag, so any trace evidence or particles fall out, and they can look closer on that. Our purview is mainly to stick with evidence or injuries on the actual body itself.
Did you have any doubt in your mind whatsoever that Mrs. Ward was present for a gunshot?
I do not.
Okay. And is there anything about the manner of death, any basis of your decision that this was a homicide as opposed to a suicide or a struggle that we have not discussed?
I don't believe so, no.
No other questions of this witness?
How you holding up? Do you need a break before the cross-examination? No? Everybody good? All right. Cross.
Good. Good morning, doctor. My name is Sean Ellsworth. I represent Bob Ward.
Good morning.
Even though you have characterized this as a homicide, that doesn't mean a crime was committed, correct?
That's correct.
There's no connection between your classification of a homicide and the outcome.
Can you define the outcome?
A crime was committed.
That's correct. Our definition of homicide strictly means death at the hands of another. It's got no legal basis to it.
Thank you, doctor. When the body was brought to the medical examiner's office, both the hands and the feet were bagged, correct?
Yes.
And those bags on the hands and feet have a twofold purpose, correct?
What are you?
Well, one is to protect the hands during transport.
Yes.
And the second would be if trace evidence were to fall off the hands, it could be tested in the bags.
Correct.
But I think as we just heard you say, that's not your job to test those insides of those bags if it needs to be done, correct?
That's correct.
Somebody else's job.
Law enforcement, again, would collect the evidence, and if they felt the need to test them, they would.
And in fact, the bags from the hands and the feet were returned to the Orange County Sheriff's Office on September 24th of 2009, correct?
I don't recall the exact date.
Would that be in your report?
It wouldn't be in my report, no.
Okay. You don't recall, but you know they were returned shortly after?
If they wanted it, we saved it for them, and they will pick it up with the other evidence.
So you don't know?
I don't recall specifically, no.
And there's nothing you can look at to give the jury the answer to that question?
Yeah, I can see if it's somewhere in the case file, not my actual report.
Yep. Please do, because we want to get all the answers.
That was picked up by law enforcement on September 24th, 2009 at 9 a.m.
Okay, so on September 24th, the bags for both the hands and the feet were returned to or were picked up by the Orange County Sheriff's Department.
That's correct.
And do you know if subsequent to that they were tested?
I have no knowledge of that.
Dr. Stephany, what is histology?
Histology is basically microscopy. We take small sections of tissue or organs and look at them under the microscope.
Was histology done in this case?
Not by me, no.
Now, you are aware, are you not, that it is possible to test gunshot residue on clothing, correct?
Yes.
And I think you testified on direct that you made a determination that there was stippling on the eyeball of Mrs. Ward, correct?
Correct.
And there was a lack of stippling on the eyelids, correct?
I believe so, yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. And that means to you, from a medical perspective, that Mrs. Ward's eyes were open at the time she was shot, correct?
Yes.
And Mrs. Ward did not move after she was shot. She went down to where she was shot, correct?
Her general position was remained the same at the time she was shot. Whether or not there was some slight movement or twitching, I can't tell. But where she was shot was basically where her body stayed.
Where she was shot is basically where her body stayed.
Correct.
Okay. With respect to the stomach contents, you were able to find a liquid which was tinted pink color in her stomach.
That's correct.
Okay. And I think Mr. J asked you whether or not that could have been wine.
Yes,
Could it have been wine?
it could have.
We don't know whether it was or wasn't, do we?
No,
Could it have been from the pill citalopram?
I don't believe so.
What color is citalopram?
I believe it's white. I don't think it's red or fluid.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the answer.
I believe it's white.
You
White
believe-
tablet. I don't believe it's a red fluid.
Okay, what color is Celexa?
Celexa, I don't recall specifically.
Okay. And you understand that Celexa is the name brand for the drug citalopram?
Yes.
Okay. And you don't know what color that is?
No, I mean, citalopram could become as a generic form, or Celexa is the trade name, so.
And the reason why we don't know whether it's citalopram, wine, something else, is because you didn't test it, right?
Correct.
But we do know that at the time of Mrs. Ward's death, she had citalopram in her system.
Yes.
You just don't know at what level.
Well, we can approximate the level.
What's the approximation?
Well, the best we can do is take the postmortem level of 840 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay, and is 840 a high, low, medium dose?
It depends what your frame of reference is. To be a cause of death is very low.
Yeah, I'm not asking if it was her cause of death. I mean, has anyone suggested that the citalopram caused Mrs. Ward's death?
No.
Okay.
You asked me
So-
whether high, low, or, and that's my frame of reference.
Okay, well, is 840 a higher than normal dose of citalopram?
In a living individual, yes.
Citalopram is used to treat anxiety,
Yes.
obsessive compulsive disease,
Yes.
and depression.
Yes.
Did you speak with Mrs. Ward's doctor during your investigation autopsy?
I did not.
Now, with respect to the citalopram, you can't give an exact time frame of how long those pills would last in her stomach, correct?
No.
Yes, I'm correct?
No, I cannot. Repeat your question and answer it again.
Okay, I think we went sideways with each other. My question was, you can't give an exact time frame of how long the citalopram pills would last in her stomach.
No, I cannot.
Okay. We do know the amount of alcohol in her system, correct?
Yes.
And you're comfortable that your testing of the alcohol, both in the vitreous, which is the eye, and in the blood, is a number that you're satisfied with?
Yes, again, in this case, I don't believe we have a vitreous level, but the blood level, yes.
Okay, so you didn't test according to you, you didn't test the vitreous for alcohol.
Correct.
But you do understand that she did have alcohol in her system when she died.
Yes.
And what was the amount of alcohol in her system when she died?
Well, again, this postmortem is the closest approximation we can get, was 0.113.
And that's over the legal limit to drive a vehicle?
That's correct.
But you don't know, as you explained to the jury earlier, what effect that alcohol had on Mrs. Ward.
That's correct.
And you don't know what effect the citalopram had on Mrs. Ward.
That's correct.
And we left one out, I think, but there was trazodone in her system as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay. What is trazodone?
Trazodone is another type of drug that can be used as a sedative to help treat anti-anxiety or depression.
Okay, and with respect to the trazodone, there was a much smaller amount of trazodone compared to the citalopram, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, with respect to the distance from the gun to Mrs. Ward's face, you can't give an exact distance, can you?
I cannot.
So the 18 inches that you talked about, that's an estimate, isn't it?
Yes, the 18 inches is the closest approximation that we have.
Isn't it true, doctor, that you can only give a range of where you think it would be from the stippling pattern?
Yes.
And you believe the distance between the firearm and Mrs. Ward's face was between 12 and 18 inches, don't you?
Yes.
With regard to the angle, you can't give an exact angle, can you?
We don't give angles anyways. As far as degrees or things like that, 45, 90, we don't do that. Our trajectories or angles are basically in relation to the decedent, the position that they are in the anatomic position, meaning did it go up, down, left, right, front to back, in their anatomic position. We don't really do angles.
Right, you determine the path of the projectile, whether it's up, down, left, right, back, front,
That's correct.
but not exact angles.
That's correct.
And in this case, I think he determined that it was front to back and slightly upwards.
Yes.
But the exact path, or the path of the projectile, which is the bullet, that doesn't tell us a whole lot about where the firearm was when it went off, does it?
No.
And anything can happen in a struggle, can it?
It's possible.
Doctor, taking into account the distance and trajectory, the wound here certainly could have been inflicted over a struggle with a gun, correct?
It's possible.
Doctor, that's all I have. Thank you.
Redirect.
You were just asked about where the firearm was when it went off. When a projectile gets fired from a firearm, especially at such short distances, under 3 feet, would the projectile go straight?
Yes, if it did not hit anything else.
All right. So we can say that it was, no matter how her head might have been turned, the firearm was in front of that wound, slightly to the right, and slightly below the anatomic position. So something like this, is that fair?
Correct.
No matter what
Yeah.
way her head was
No
facing.
matter what way her head was turned, the end of the barrel of that gun was in front of her.
And from the blood patterns in that room, obviously the same, except for the reverse, is true. At some point in time, that wound had to face those blood patterns.
That's correct.
Now, the toxicology report. Have you looked at both pages of the toxicology report?
I'm only seeing page 1.
Would it help you to be able to see the second page?
Yes, it would.
May I approach?
You may.
What I'm showing you is what is bait stamped 172 in Discovery. Can you tell me if you can read that? I can make it brighter if you need it.
No, that's okay. So, yes, to correct my earlier statements, that I didn't have page 2 to look at. Vitreous fluid was also done to look at the alcohol level.
And was that at 0.110?
Yes.
So that's within 3/1000ths of the blood sample?
Yes.
What, if anything, does that tell you that's relevant to the cause and manner of this person's death?
Nothing really.
Other than that, perhaps the level of alcohol was somewhat plateaued?
That's correct. The way alcohol works, or any drug, as I kind of alluded to earlier, you take a drug in, it goes in your blood. As you stop taking the drug or alcohol, it will plateau and then start to metabolize, so it will go down. The reason oftentimes we take blood and vitreous is to see if those levels are consistent. Sometimes, for instance, blood may be taken near an area where, say, rubbing alcohol was done or an IV fluid was in. So we want to make sure those levels are somewhat comparable. So when we do the blood and then also test the vit, if they're close enough, then we know those levels are pretty much the same and are accurate.
Now let's talk about the stomach contents. Hypothetically, if there's citalopram in somebody's stomach contents, is that citalopram there in the stomach in that person's bloodstream?
Depending on when they took it. If they had just taken a pill, you'd often see pill fragments or some kind of gritty material. Over time, as it is absorbed or disintegrates, it'll go into the bloodstream. So, for us, if something in someone's stomach, it just means they just took it. It doesn't mean it necessarily is absorbed into the blood already. If we have the blood levels, then we don't necessarily need the stomach levels. We know what's in the blood.
And was there any food in her stomach?
No.
Would food being in one's stomach slow down the process of absorption of any medicine they take?
It can, yes.
All right. Now let's go real briefly to one last area. If Mrs. Ward had been standing when she suffered that gunshot wound, what effect would that have on her ability to stand?
The gunshot wound?
Yeah.
Oh, it would stop it. I mean, if someone's shot in the head as she was, causing the destruction, she would probably go down almost instantly, if not instantly. And you saw that in the pictures. Her final resting place, or where she was found when our investigators got there, there was no blood anywhere else in the room. The blood was all there. So that, and when you look at the picture of the shoes, there was no blood on the bottom of the shoes, meaning she obviously didn't walk anywhere or walk through blood. So for me, what that tells me is when our investigators got there, or when law enforcement got there and found her in that final position, that is the area of the room that she was shot.
And if one had his or her arms up when suffering such a gunshot wound, what would happen to his or her arms?
Well, if the arms are in the vicinity or below where that gunshot wound would be, I would expect to see a lot of blood coming out of that wound onto an individual's hands.
What about the ability to maintain holding arms up?
Oh, it'd be much like if she was standing. If someone was shot and they're holding their arms out, they go down almost instantly, much like she would if she was shot. She would go down almost instantly.
No other questions?
May this witness be excused.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, doctor. You're free to go.
Thank you.
All right, this is a good time for our morning break before we take the next witness. 15 minutes. I'll see you guys back here. Mr. Ellsworth, how are we coming on the gun issue? Are you I assume you're handling this because the memo was written by you. So.
Your Honor, you're right, and I made a mistake. Scala, our notes said it. We don't have the site that Mr. Scala disassembled the gun, so we're going to abandon that argument. And our argument, basically, and I apologize to the court, and I apologize to Mr. Jay.
No problem.
Our argument, which is stated in the motion or the memorandum, is simply that the staleness of the fact that the gun's been sitting around for 8.5 years, 8.5 years, hasn't been in our possession. So we didn't have the ability to, we believe it's the state's burden to show that the gun is in the same condition as it was on September 21st, 2009. We believe that burden belongs to the state, and we believe the state has not met that burden.
Thank you, Mr. Ellsworth. State.
Judge, it's in evidence. Witnesses were asked if it appeared to be in substantially the same condition as when they last saw it. They said yes. Outside of the record, I mean, we all had the opportunity to examine this. I offered them the ability to pull the trigger. They didn't want to during the evidence view. So the record evidence is it's in substantially the same condition as when it was. And I don't know, I mean, I guess it's kind of like a chain of custody argument, but I think they have some sort of burden of establishing that it's not when people have said that it is.
Mr. Ellsworth, you're not arguing that there's any damage to the gun, are you? Do you have any evidence of this? As you know our chain of custody rules, because you're licensed in Florida. So,
I am, Your Honor.
Yeah, okay.
25 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You're just a
No,
young...
and I thought I just said we weren't arguing that the gun had been tampered with. I thought I tried to make that clear. If I didn't, I apologize again.
No. I understand that you all just made a mistake and thought the gun had been disassembled, but abandoned that argument. This would be different. This is, do you have, I mean, on our chain of custody rules, if you have some evidence that in some way that gun has been, even time has altered it, or is this just an argument that you're making?
Time is the argument. And
Time
what
is
we're-
the sole argument.
Our argument is, and it doesn't have anything to do with the chain of custody. Our argument is that time, the state has a burden to prove that given the passage of 8.5 years, that gun is in the same condition as it was on September 21st, 2009. And our secondary argument is, if the court is going to allow the jury to examine the gun, we have grave concerns about the experimentation that's going to be going on back in that jury room with reenactments, with, it's been the defense that there's been a struggle, and we just fear that jurors are going to be back there playing Mr. Ward, playing Mrs. Ward, playing distances, playing with the gun, and if the court is going to allow the jury to examine the gun, we would request that it be done in the presence of the attorneys.
I believe that the state is asking to publish the gun without the lock to the jury this morning here in the jury box, is what I'm having a discussion about at the moment.
Well, that's the alternative. The state's request under the case law is that it go back to the jury for deliberations.
All right, you guys are going back and forth here. Did you not say this morning that you wanted the jury to be able to pull the trigger while sitting in the jury box?
What I said this morning was that if the gun is not going back, as I believe the law allows and suggests perhaps it should, that this is the time for me to do it during my case. And just for the record, I have everything word searchable under the trial transcripts. The only mention of the word disassemble was in regards to a cartridge casing. So I just wanted to let him know that I think that's where the confusion came from. I didn't think there was anything nefarious going on. That's where I found it.
I didn't take this as a nefarious attempt on the part of the defense to mislead the court. That's an almost 3,000-page transcript. It's hard to remember what anyone said without triple checking it. So I didn't take it that way, but I appreciate your clarification. Like I said, your memo I got this morning, and I had enough time to read through it, but I had looked at the case law over the weekend and the testimony from the prior case. And honestly, I don't think I have a choice. The gun is a critical part of the evidence in this case. Case law in Florida is pretty clear that the jury can examine whatever evidence is admitted during the trial. So if the jury asks to see the gun for it to go back into the jury room, I think it has to go back to the jury room. I don't think I have a legal basis to tell them you can't have the gun. And given the testimony in this case, I have never done this before in a murder trial or in any case involving a gun. But given the testimony in this case about the pull and all of that, I'm certainly not going to suggest to the jury that they do anything. That would be inappropriate. But I think if they want to pull the trigger on that gun, because 12.5 pounds, it's 12 to 12.5 pounds is what the testimony was. That's quite a pull on a trigger. And we have several members of the jury. I went back to jury selection and looked. We have several members of the jury who are familiar with guns.
Yes, we do.
They're entitled to explore the evidence. I think it would be inappropriate for the court to refuse to let the gun go back into the jury room if the jury requests it, and to take the lock off of it with some precautions that we're going to have to institute when we're sending a gun back into a jury room, which I will discuss with the sheriff's department here, and will include, there will be no ammunition in that jury room. If the gun is requested to go back, all of the other evidence must be removed from the jury room to make sure we didn't mistakenly get one, and I am going to allow the deputies, out of the presence of the jury, I'll have them take a break or something, search the jury room to make sure. And I'm still talking to the sheriff's department about any other security procedures. They will all be discussed with the attorneys prior to this happening. And this is all based on whether the jury asked me for the gun. So, okay, anything else?
Yes, Your Honor. And perhaps this is premature, but at the time, if the gun is asked for, will the court permit argument as to what instruction goes back with the jury when the gun is sent back to the jury room?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I actually wasn't going to give them any instruction, but yes, if there's something you all want to talk about, absolutely.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Sure, and actually, it's looking based on the schedule. Are you all going to rest Wednesday afternoon or Wednesday morning? And I recognize this is a guess on your part. Do you know?
Judge, at this point, we have witnesses. Here's the short answer to your question. I have every reason to believe we are going to be resting Wednesday afternoon.
Late in the afternoon? I'm trying to figure out when we're going to do charge conference. My preference is to do charge conference Wednesday.
Okay.
Get the jury instructions, which are not complicated in this case.
Right.
It's one charge. There's a firearm involved, so we have to have the special findings. And then at that time also, I'd like you to propose whatever you might propose so that we can all start to do this at one time. Then we would do instructions and closings on Thursday morning and hand the case over to the jury.
That squares with everything we plan.
Okay.
I do have one caveat, and we may come up a little short this afternoon, but
As in you're going to run out of witnesses early?
this afternoon we may.
Great, then we can do a preliminary charge conference this afternoon. We have the old instructions that I have actually printed already, but they're and they seem to be pretty close to what the instructions need to be now.
And when I say we're short this afternoon, that doesn't affect my answer that I gave previously that we anticipate resting on Wednesday
Okay,
afternoon.
no problem.
Thank
Trials
you.
are an inexact science. Why don't you guys take a break? Who's next? Do you have any other witnesses, Mr. J? Video?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so why don't you all take a 10-minute break? I'm sure you need one.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Just tell the jury we're going to be an extra 5 minutes or so. Court's in